I'm Liz Rischel. I am the Executive Director at the Warren Heritage Society. Am I loud enough? Do you feel like, okay. I think we can probably ditch the mic. This room is not as loud as the room that we were using last month, which is good. It's the carpet kind of absorbed. But we're so glad you're here. Thank you for coming out in the nasty weather. I thought it was spring, but I was wrong.
No.
Fall spring. It's fine. It's fall spring. I know. Fall spring. I know. I wanted to say thank you a million times over. I think she's having to deal with some stuff in the other room, but to Terry Jenkins, who owns Stone Branch Center for the Arts. She has been so generous in letting us use this space. She also let us use her space last month, and we are so lucky to have these community partners that let us come and take over their world for a little while. So if you have the chance to thank Terry, we'll make sure that if she comes along, we'll show her to you, but please do so and come back, because as you can tell, they're doing a lot of fun, dynamic stuff in this room. So they're really amazing. On your chair, you may have seen that you have a membership brochure. We love our members, and membership comes with privileges these days. So check out our website for a little bit more information, but the intention with membership is not only that it is a sustaining way to support the Warren Heritage Society, we also are going to give you perks like first crack at some of those great tickets for events. And right now, our members have the first availability of tickets to our March tea called Petals and Pinkies. Get it? Okay. Just need to explain that. You know, if it needs explaining, that's what we need. But so membership, like I said, has its privileges, and I hope you'll consider supporting us in that way. I promised Kim, and this is Kim and Hannah over here. There are two other staff members. I promised Kim that I would mention that we are always looking for dedicated volunteers to come and help us at the Warren Heritage Society. Events like this don't happen easily with just 3 staff members and nobody else to support us. So we would love, if you have something that interests you, come and sit down with Kim, and she's going to find you something that is going to change your life and create magic in your world. And I would hope that you would think about your gifts and give them to us, because we will use them. And I guess I'll introduce our wonderful speaker here. So I have the pleasure of introducing Dana Shoaf. He is the Director of Interpretation at the National Museum of Civil War Medicine. So Dana and I first met, I think, about 20 years ago.
It's been a long time.
It's been a long time. I was serving as the archivist at the Historical Society in Frederick, Maryland, where I first met Dana. His wife is actually was the curator at that time, and she has gone on to do amazing, big, huge things. But Dana and I met then.
It's Heritage Frederick now. They changed
I
the name.
know. I think that's interesting. I want to know more about that.
Yeah.
But I'm excited to reconnect with you, and thank you for being here and taking the time to drive all the way over here. We appreciate it. But Dana, I'm going to just read your bio because I think people need to understand how amazing you are.
No.
So Dana joined the National Museum of Civil War Medicine, the National Museum of Civil War Medicine in November of 2023 after years as the editor of the Civil War Times magazine. The editor, folks. At the museum, he is currently leading the redesign of the museum's galleries. His popular Medical Minute series can be seen on YouTube, along with other videos and talks representing the NMCWM. In addition, Dana schedules the yearly speaker series and helps select products for the museum's book and gift shop. And as comes with a small staff, he paints, he cleans bathrooms, and he moves tables around as needed. Dana is a frequent speaker at conferences and seminars and on podcasts. So he's been on a little thing called NPR. He's appeared on a little network called C-SPAN. He has been invited to serve as a consultant for projects at the National Archives, the Smithsonian Institution, the Washington Post, and the National Park Service. and he has led battlefield tours in fair and foul weather for numerous organizations and institutes. He has spent his life pursuing his historical passions, and he is an avid student and collector of Civil War and 19th century occupational photography. Dana and his wife Heidi restored and sold a 1830 stone house, and they are currently restoring another stone house, aka Money Pit, built in the late 18th and 19th centuries, where they reside with indulged cats and dogs. So welcome, Dana, and thank you very much.
I kind of turned here, there's this giant black cat right over my shoulder, and we have 2 black cats, so I kind of feel at home. We had 2 cats, and then a friend of ours in Philadelphia trapped cats living in her yard, so we said, oh, we'll take the little black female, which has been sort of a mistake because she's terrorizing everybody, including me. So I kind of feel at home with a cat looming over me ready to attack. Thank you, Liz, for that wonderful introduction. As she said, my wife Heidi was a curator at the time, and that was a long time ago. How many of you have been to the National Museum of Civil War Medicine in Frederick? Oh, good. Well, as Liz mentioned, actually next year will be the 30th anniversary of that museum, and we are completely redesigning it now. When I came on board in November 23, the director, David Price, said, you know, we're going to upgrade the lighting. And I said, maybe we should just trash a lot of stuff and redo it because it's been up for 20 years. And he agreed, so we're going into it full tilt. We've acquired some really great new objects and artifacts over the past couple of years. And we have accumulated some things that haven't been on display, and they're going to come out. And we hope to have this all done in May of 2027. So, you know, if you can't make it up before then, certainly come after when we've got this redesign done. When I went to the museum in that November 2023, I realized that, you know, even though I had been studying the Civil War and interested in it really most of my adult life, or even before that, I knew really very little about the medical history of the war. And so I've continually been surprised by what I've learned about some of the advancements and some of the people involved in on both sides of the conflict regarding medical advancements. And one of the things that surprised me the most was that before the Civil War, there were no ambulances in the United States. And the United States Army, of course before secession, did not use ambulances at all. They used whatever wagons they could find after a battle to haul wounded men off the battlefield. And so the war will bring on a revolution in the use of ambulances. And what they're trying to avoid is what you see in my first slide here. It's called bad going. The artist James Walker did that in 1862. If you could see the extension of that image, there are 6 horses pulling that wagon. That's a lot of horse flesh to pull one wagon. And it's not a specialized ambulance, it's just a wagon that they had around. But if you look closely, these 2 items back here are wounded soldiers. That's the top of their caps that have just kind of been put in there. So they are trying, when the war begins, to develop purpose-built vehicles for removal of the wounded. I have a good quote to start this off. This is from Surgeon Charles S. Tripler. Charles Tripler was the medical director of the Army of the Potomac, 1861 to July 1862. And when I say surgeon, a surgeon during the Civil War is just a doctor, basically. They just use the term surgeon. And he had to do a report of his term in service. And in his report, he writes this paragraph: previous to this war, the Army of the United States had never been supplied with carriages expressly designed for the transportation of the sick and wounded. So they were not around. To see how they come into being, we have to take a step back a few years. And I think that I hit the space bar in a little advance.
Or the arrow.
The arrow. Let me try
To the
that.
side.
I don't want to do that because it says X. How about this? There we go. Okay, got it. So let's go back a little bit to 1855. Let's see if I can we got a little bit of their heads cut off there. I don't know if it's adjusted.
It's probably my fault. I kind of moved this one
I can't. I won't accept that. It's not your fault.
out.
You don't
It's
make
my
mistakes.
doing.
Well, anyway, we can go ahead.
Keep going. Yeah.
I'll adjust this. Yeah, needed. So we have to go back to the Crimean War. Okay, the Crimean War takes place from 1853 to 1856. It will pit Russia, the country of Russia, against France, the allies of France, the Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, and the Kingdom of Sardinia, Piedmont, fairly small country in what is today Italy. And they're fighting Russia over the control of the Crimean Peninsula, which is just below the Ukraine. It has a familiar ring to it, right? So Jefferson Davis, at that time, he will become the president of the Confederacy, as many of you know, is the Secretary of the War. And he will appoint a commission of 3 officers to go over and study that conflict. One of the guys that almost made the cut but didn't quite make it was a guy named Robert E. Lee. But he's in the running to go on this commission, but at the last minute, he's not chosen, and instead, that gentleman on the left will go, and that is Captain George McClellan. He's 28 years old at the time. Of course, he's going to become commander of the Army of the Potomac during the Civil War, and he will play a vital role in all of this stuff. McClellan is chosen. He's 28, and he will go over there with the gentleman to his immediate left or your right. That is Colonel Richard Delafield, and Major Alfred Mordecai is on the right. Delafield will be the leader of the commission. The gentleman standing behind them is a Russian liaison officer. It took them weeks to get over there. You know, it was a real journey in itself just to get from the United States to the Crimea. In true McClellan fashion, he writes his wife, "I never want to be stuck with 2 old fogies for this long again." You know, and he's, you know, there's just something about George, right? He's got that attitude from the time he's a young officer. But these 3 officers will arrive in the Crimea, and they will miss most of the major fighting. Most of the fighting is concluded by the time they get there, but they get to see a lot of the aftermath of the battle. They get to see a lot of the earthworks. And some of these things, if you're not familiar with the Delafield Commission, it has a huge impact on the Civil War with what these officers observe and will write about. And the other thing they observe closely are the medical practices of the European powers. What do they do? How do they handle their wounded? They come back to the United States, and they immediately begin on working on a report. And even before the report is published, word gets out, you know, what they're working on and what they've learned, you know, gets around the military. But in 1859, they formally publish the Delafield Commission report. And it has a large section on medical care, okay? And you can see the cover of it right here. And there are a number of really important sections in this. I know that's hard to read. But one of the things that's written in that paragraph is that the French, particularly, they noticed have a system whereby they have ambulances that bring men to aid stations as close to the battle line as possible. Then those men, once they're able to move at all, are taken to field hospitals just outside of the shooting range of the battle, where they get additional treatment. And they may stay there for as long as they need to before they can be transported again to general hospitals, which are in urban areas and are more permanent structures, okay? You've heard of Florence Nightingale, right? Florence Nightingale was a British nurse who worked in one of these general hospitals and wrote reports about how they needed to be cleaned up and how they should be functioning, right? So, this report comes out in 1859. They break down how the wounded are removed, and they talk a lot about ambulances in this report. How valuable they were, how they were constructed. You see the upper right engraving, that is a British ambulance that actually had a rack in it to put weapons. When they put the wounded men in, they could put their racks above it. And I wanted to show you that interesting little chair on the side of that mule. That's called a cassoulet. C-A-C-O-L-E-T. The French used those. And they were little, basically chairs that you would put wounded men in get them off the battlefield. The United States Army, the Army of the Potomac, actually tried those during the Peninsula Campaign. And they were very inefficient. You only could haul 2 guys, and then if a man is badly wounded, getting them in that chair, it just wasn't practical. But, there's all sorts of discussion about how to get wounded off the battlefield for the first time. This will lead to the development of the first ambulance adopted by the United States Army. Charles Tripler, I just mentioned the name to him, pretty prominent surgeon. This is his ambulance he invented, and basically what he did was he took a wagon and he converted it to haul wounded men. It was in use by 1859, right when that report comes out. So like I said, word had been getting out even ahead of time about the use of ambulances, and he begins to work on this. It had 2 levels in it, so you could put wounded men top and bottom. It had its own medicine chest, but it was very heavy, because it's just a converted wagon. It's very heavy, and it requires 4 horses to pull it. That's a lot of horse flesh when you're looking at an army, okay? But that is the first ambulance that the United States Army will try to use. Almost in a reaction to that big ambulance, they go in the other direction. And they, right before the war, these 2 variations of a 2-wheeled ambulance are developed. 2 wheels, okay? Each one could hold about 4 patients. The one on the top was developed by Assistant Surgeon Richard Coolidge, and the one on the bottom was developed by Surgeon Clement Finley, okay? So these 2 ambulances are a reaction. They only need 1 horse to pull them. They're trying to conserve horses. But they were horrible ambulances. They were called Gutbusters because they were so bouncy, with just 2 wheels, and they're so light. Every little bump in the road that they would feel, they would jar the wounded terribly. It's no exaggeration to say, as on the bottom quote there, Surgeon General Joseph K. Barnes, the last Surgeon General of the United States Army during the war, said, "Their motion was intolerable and excruciating, and wounded men begged to be taken out." And I've read letters, it's very true. That's exactly what happened. The North American Review, kind of a popular mechanics of the era, reviewed these and said, "No man who has once ridden in a 2-wheeled ambulance would willingly get into one again, even if he were well." So you don't want to ride in these things. Now they're going to use Tripler ambulances and these 2-wheelers the whole war, just because of expediency, and the demand is so great. So you're going to see them used much longer than they wanted to use them. But we are going to get a new ambulance. And this is going to enter the gentleman on the left into the medical picture of the war. And he's going to become really prominent and develop a lot of innovations that we still use today. His name was Jonathan Letterman. He's from Western Pennsylvania originally. And he was the medical director for William Rosecrans, that officer on the right, the general on the right, in Western Virginia very early in the war, the summer 1861 to March 1862. He is Rosecrans' medical director. Rosecrans really was a smart guy, and of course, the higher you graduate at West Point, the more likely you're going to be in engineering class. And he was an engineer. He started out in the engineer service. So he's got design skills, and he, of course, Letterman has medical knowledge. And Rosecrans basically says to Letterman, "We need a new ambulance. The ones that we have are impractical." They had, I think, mostly Triplers. They're too heavy for these narrow roads out here. They need too many horses to pull them. Let's sit down and develop a new ambulance. And they do. These 2 gentlemen will sit down, put their heads together, using Rosecrans' engineering skills and Letterman's sort of medical practice and practicality, and they will develop what is called the Rosecrans ambulance, or the Wheeling ambulance, okay? It's called the Wheeling because the first ones were made in what is today Wheeling, West Virginia, the first models. I have this really cool ad that was taken out of the Wheeling Daily Intelligencer, January 1st, 1862. There's a little section in the newspaper, ambulances. Busby, Little, and Hayes. They were carriage makers in Wheeling.
Busby, Little, and Hayes are making about 100 ambulances for the Army. The ambulances are intended to be drawn by 2 horses, the old 2-wheel, 1-horse varieties having been found wanting because no one liked them. The ambulances manufactured by the firm are the very best material and are not excelled in finish or durability. General Rosecrans has pronounced them the very thing. And you're looking at, I think, one of the first wheeling ambulances made, photographed on the street in Wheeling, West Virginia. Okay? If you look closely here, it says Daguerrean Gallery. This is a photographer's gallery. See the photographs? So they just pulled it down there. The photographer has come out and set his camera up on the street and taken a picture of this. And you can see the seat in here that's covered with oilcloth that can be wiped down easily. The interior of the ambulance was also covered with oilcloth so that it could be wiped down. It had this canvas cover that could be rolled up for better air circulation. It had 4 wheels with springs. No Civil War ambulance gives you a good ride, right? They're all terrible in a way, but they're trying to make them better, and they put springs on this thing to try to even out the ride, and it only requires 2 horses to pull it. It cuts down the number of horses in half, okay? So this is the Wheeling ambulance. This will become the most widely produced ambulance of the Civil War and used east and west, and the Confederates will make their own copies when they can. They will copy it, okay? It holds about 11 to 12 men seated, and then it can be reconfigured into a flat platform to hold patients that are laying down. It will hold 4 men across. When we do our redesign, we're going to have one of these cross sections so you can see inside and take a look and understand how it works. We also own a full-scale reproduction of this that we take out for events and show people, and it's really interesting to see. So this is a pretty amazing photograph in my mind because it's this early ambulance. This is another view. I think this is taken across the street, and you can see the back door opened up here. So that's where you put the patients in, and you can see this oilcloth seating area. This is arranged as a seat, but if you wanted, this is arranged as a platform. If you want to make a seat, you just kind of move this little metal support rod, and this will swing down, and then this becomes a seat over here. This is a 5-gallon water keg that would be attached, and originally some of the models vary a little bit. They have water kegs on both sides. I've seen photos where the one water keg is gone and they got extra stretchers shoved in there. So that's interesting. And it's got US on here and some nice pinstriping. This is an early one. They didn't get all that fancy with the paint jobs as the war went on. But again, this is a very early prototype being shown on the streets of Wheeling. Really fascinating documentation. So we've got an ambulance that's going to work, right? And they're going to produce these, not just in Wheeling. You'll see a photo later of an ambulance yard in Alexandria where they made a lot of them. So we have an ambulance, but we still have a problem. There's no overall plan or doctrine for the use of these ambulances. How do you use them, right? So it's just kind of helter-skelter. Ambulance drivers were generally some of the weakest soldiers you had. They would grab the guys they didn't think made the best soldiers. They would make them the drivers. They would also make them the stretcher barriers, right? That's not the best way to go about it. They would hire civilians, which is a problem because the civilians don't really like military authority and don't feel like they have to answer to it. So the use of the ambulance is not great. And at the first Battle of Bull Run, can I say Bull Run down here in Shenandoah Valley? Should I say Manassas? Yeah, I'll say First Battle of Manassas. There were ambulances present, but they were not used well, and wounded men laid on the battlefield for a week after the engagement. Many of them just die in the fields. There's accounts, documented accounts of, there's one documented account of a man having his arm amputated and then sort of staggering back into Washington because he couldn't find a way to get back in there. It was a big mess. So they don't have a way to use these things. Charles Tripler, right? I mentioned him, the medical director. He wants to develop an ambulance corps, but he can't get it going in time at least for this First Battle of the War. So, then we have a big change, okay? After the First Battle of Manassas, the United States Sanitary Commission, have you heard of them? Like a big civilian volunteer friends group for the United States government, basically, is formed. The General Secretary was Frederick Law Olmsted, the famous architect who designed Central Park. A lot of familiar names are involved in this organization. They will organize women nurses, all sorts of stuff, food drives, sanitary fairs to raise money to support the war effort, but they are mostly interested in the health of the soldiers and health care. And the Sanitary Commission begins to put pressure on Secretary of War Edwin Stanton. And they put the pressure on Stanton, and they are pressuring him because they don't like Clement Finley. Clement Finley is the current Surgeon General of the United States Army. He's the first one to serve in that position during the war. They considered him old and out of date. He was 65 at the time. It's only a year older than I am. He was called an ossified fool by one member of the Sanitary Commission. He was born in the 18th century, and for my birthday, my coworker Melissa Wynn, our Director of Marketing and Communications, gave me a t-shirt that said, "I'm from the 1900s" on it. She thought that was pretty funny. But he's born in the 18th century. And he probably was a little over his head. He also was kind of cantankerous. He did not get along well with Stanton, and Stanton will relieve him and bow to the pressure of the Sanitary Commission because they want their man put in place. And their man is this gentleman on the left, Surgeon General William Hammond. Now you notice these guys are all in that 30-year-old range. They're young dudes for the time, right? Young guys, maybe more progressive. Hammond was known as being a progressive surgeon. He had written some books before the war, some new ideas about healthcare. And the problem is that he doesn't have the seniority to become Surgeon General, because it's literally a rank. You become Brigadier General, and at the time it's based on, just like any other general, it's when it's seniority, right? So he's not senior. He's got a lot of other surgeons that have been in the Army longer than him. Congress is going to pass a law in the case of the Surgeon General to make it a meritocracy and say seniority doesn't matter. So they go to all these efforts to get him in place. Stanton kind of bows to it. He's like, okay, and he will become Surgeon General on April 25th. No, that's wrong. He becomes Surgeon General shortly after the Battle of Manassas. Okay. So Hammond immediately wants to implement and put in place ambulance corps in all United States armies. There's not just the Army of the Potomac that went out east. There's several. He wants to have an ambulance corps for all of them. Secretary of War Stanton and General-in-Chief Henry Halleck, the overall military command of the Army, say no. We can't deal with that right now. We're struggling just to get these armies organized, and you're asking us to put in a whole bunch more logistical and administrative work. So Hammond says, all right, well, I'm at least going to focus on the Army of the Potomac, the army that's out here, and I'm going to get an ambulance corps in that army. And what he does, one of his first steps, is that he will relieve Charles Tripler of his duty. Now, I don't think Tripler was doing a bad job, but Hammond and Letterman were friends from before the war. They had taken the Army medical exam together. Hammond trusted Letterman, he liked Letterman, and he will make Letterman the medical director of the Army of the Potomac in June of 1862. That's when Letterman steps in and starts to figure out what's going on. Now, the General-in-Chief of the Army of the Potomac, when a lot of this begins to move quickly, is the guy on the right we've already mentioned, Major General George McClellan. Now we know McClellan has been to the Crimea. We know he was part of the authorship of that Delafield Commission. So we know McClellan is behind and in favor of these medical reforms. He's seen these modern practices. So he is going to greenlight. He's not going to resist. And he should get some credit for this. He's going to greenlight what these two guys want to do. Basically, he's like, do what you need to do. And McClellan's army is dying. He's on that peninsula by this time, between New York and the James Rivers, east of Richmond. 30% of his men have diseases. He's got all kind of problems. So Hammond is going to send Letterman down there, and he's going to tell him, here's what I want you to do. I want you to fix the camp situation and make them healthier. I want you to improve the nutrition, and I want you to establish an ambulance corps to get these things organized. We need to get this organized. Also, McClellan's dad, I want to point out, George McClellan Sr. had helped found Jefferson Medical College in Philadelphia, where Letterman had gone to school. All right, so there's all these connections that they've known each other. And therefore, General Orders number 147 is going to be issued in August of 1862. General Orders number 147, and for the first time in American history, there will be a full-time dedicated ambulance corps in an army, the Army of the Potomac. Just that one army is going to have the ambulance corps. And Letterman will issue the order, he will draft it out, and he will organize it quite well. I could go into all the rank structure. I won't do that because it would just get bewildering. But basically, each infantry regiment is assigned 3 ambulances and a medical wagon, which we'll talk about too, a medical wagon. And each Army Corps was going to get an additional 2 ambulances on top of that. So he wants each regiment, about 1,000 men on paper, to have 3 ambulances. Only patients and medical personnel were allowed to utilize these wagons. And he put that in the order because too many officers were using them for their baggage and appropriating them for other reasons and then when the battle came along, you know, where are the ambulances? They never really can stop guys from doing this, but they cut it down. And General Ulysses S. Grant will use an ambulance as his personal baggage wagon during the Overland campaign. Now, it's a little different when you're just Ulysses S. Grant, you're commander of all the Union armies. I think if you want an ambulance, they're going to give you one. That ambulance is on display in Petersburg at the Quartermaster Museum. You can see that. You can see that ambulance. Pardon? I heard a comment. Okay. You can see that ambulance. So, Letterman is also going to work on developing a 3-stage system that he will use with these ambulances. Okay? And that's the 3-stage system that they saw in the Crimea. Step 1 is an aid station as close to the front lines as possible. Step 2 will be the field hospitals that I'm sure you've all heard about, where you get the men in. That's where most of the amputations are done, in the field hospitals. And then as soon as they can get out of there, they don't want to keep them there any longer than they have to, they will go to general hospitals in urban areas. I work in Frederick. Frederick, Maryland is the general hospital location for the Battle of Antietam, for the Union side. That's where the Union guys go once they get out of the field hospitals. And once you get recuperated in a general hospital, you might go to a finishing hospital in an even bigger city like Philly, or you might go home, okay? But, you know, it's a 3-stage system, okay? So, he's going to work on that, and we'll talk a little bit more about that 3-stage system and how it comes into play. Wanted to show you this, though. This is a really remarkable image of a Rosecrans ambulance. And this is for some reason, the original is at Wilson's Creek National Battlefield in Missouri. We found this. But what you see there are 2 of the stretcher bearers. Each ambulance had a driver and 2 stretcher bearers. That was the crew. And this might be posed. I'm not sure if that's a real casualty or someone sort of posed back there. But they are carrying this casualty toward the Rosecrans ambulance. The back door is open. You can see the rear area is arranged in a seating pattern. That's the seating pattern that's there. And notice the legs on the stretcher as well. That was the most common model of stretcher that was used during the war as well. You could set that down if you had to with those legs. Each ambulance was to carry 2 stretchers. One is in use, and you see one on the side of the ambulance. You see the water keg back there again, and you see a lantern. Every ambulance was to have a lantern because a lot of wounded removal is done at night. It is done at night. So each one was to have a lantern for that purpose, and you have 2 horses hitched to this instead of 4. Okay, and that's really a great look at what something, a Rosecrans ambulance would have looked like in the field in use, canvas rolled up for air circulation, etc. So it's kind of crazy because they begin working on all these reforms on the peninsula, the Army of the Potomac, right? And then if you know anything about the Civil War, you know that McClellan loses his job. He's removed of command of the Army of the Potomac. And when he's removed the command, that basically, Letterman is removed as well. It's McClellan and his staff is removed. So Letterman starts these reforms and then he's kind of pulled out of it. And then there's a second Battle of Manassas, where these reforms are sort of in place, but it's not much better at Second Manassas. But Letterman and McClellan aren't involved in that. And it's after Second Manassas that they're restored. Letterman gets power back 2 weeks before the Battle of Antietam. He has to pick it up again and try to smooth things out. And there's a lot of problems at Antietam. The supplies aren't getting there on time, and you know, he's got a lot of issues. At Antietam, he's going to have 2 stages of his 3-stage system in place. He's going to have the field hospitals in place and the general hospitals. The aid stations, he doesn't have organized as well, okay? And he's going to leave the aid stations to each regiment, and it doesn't go well. So in October, that's when another order is going to get passed, formally codifying the 3-stage system. So the development of the ambulance and this 3-stage system kind of go hand in hand, right, to make it work. But on September 15th, 1862, the New York Daily Herald wrote an article, and again, Letterman's back in charge, and he's got his ambulance system put in place for the most part. At Antietam, the 9th Corps of the Army of the Potomac doesn't have ambulances because they had just been added to the Army of the Potomac. But most of his army has ambulances there, okay? And they, New York Daily Herald writes, September 15th, just 2 days before the Battle of Antietam, we are pleased to see a well-trained and properly systematized ambulance department in connection with the Army. The care of the wounded in battle is of the very highest importance. It affects the morale of the Army, and a high degree of proper precautions are not taken to protect the soldier who falls wounded in the fight. We are glad to see that McClellan has paid proper attention to this matter in his march into Maryland. Well, once the press picks it up and says you're doing a good job, then it really starts to mean something. And it kind of kicks off this ambulance design boom. You know, in the Civil War, everybody wants to make a better breech-loading carbine, right? All these people are trying to invent stuff. And so all of a sudden, you have all these different ambulance models that are being developed. This model is a late war model developed by Brigadier General Daniel Rucker, the fellow on the right. Rucker is in charge of the Washington Depot, the huge supply yard in DC. He's one of Clara Barton's best buddies, and he makes sure she has all her stuff that she needs, if you know Clara Barton, the famous humanitarian. This is the second best ambulance, really, of the Civil War. It's a little heavier than the Rosecrans, but it has a little better ride. It's got louvers for air circulation, and what's really cool, in the front wheels have a shock absorption system, so when the horses start to pull the wagon, these springs take up that initial impact so that there's not a sudden jerk when the thing begins to move, which is really hard on the wounded. Again, it's important to think that they try to improve all the time. We think of the Civil War as a lot of medical butchery, but these guys are really working hard to try to improve things. There is a Rucker ambulance. This is a famous photograph of Zouaves doing ambulance drill somewhere near DC. As I said, it's heavier. It weighs about 1,100 pounds. It's got padded leather seats instead of the oilcloth. The stretchers are on rollers for ease of taking them out and putting them in. And it's got that platform spring up front. It has smaller wheels in the front for a tighter turning radius, okay? It's a pretty good ambulance. This is the Moses ambulance. This is one that was never built. There was a prototype built. And again, this is early on when that news is getting back of European ambulances. In 1858, this was developed. It still required 6 horses to pull it, and it could haul 18 wounded. It came with its own integral hospital tent. rolled up on the side, you can see. So when you stop, you would roll down these two big canvas flaps, and then the ambulance becomes sort of the dispensary for the hospital that it goes with the ambulance. However, when what happens to canvas when it gets wet? It gets really, really heavy. So when they would roll the canvas up, there was a fear it would become top heavy and tip easily. And it was also expensive to produce, so the Army rejected this one. The Langer ambulance wagon, this is pretty interesting. In 1864, 1865, the 5th Corps of the Army of the Potomac developed their own ambulances. And I think this is during the Siege of Petersburg, and frankly, I think some of these guys are bored, and they convert some of these wagons to ambulances, and you can see how they've got them set up to put stretchers in there and hold wounded men. They apparently were pretty efficient, but again, they require a lot of horses, and they were too complicated for the Army to adopt in large scale. But this is another example of them developing an ambulance and trying to, improve removing wounded from the battlefield. This is my favorite model. This is Moritz Pinner's ambulance kitchen. And I always think of like gypsies rolling around with this thing with, that's a smokestack on the top of it, or Mr. Toad and Wind in the Willows driving that around with smoke curling out of the stack. So Moritz Pinner says, man, this thing's great. You don't need anything else. This is, it's got its own kitchen and bakery on board. It's also used as an ambulance. You can put men in the back, and you can carry their own provisions, and it has its own medicine chest. And he patents this on January 27th, 1863. And this is from the patent drawing. And he gets this book done. And I've got to get up to Carlisle Barracks to see this. One survives. He collects a book of testimonials, how great this ambulance is. One of the testimonials in that book is from Ambrose Burnside, who was also a general that was in command of the Army of the Potomac for a while. And Burnside apparently says, this is the greatest ambulance I've ever seen. And I think a lot of people looked at this and were like, no way, this is not going to work. So none of these were ever built either, this ambulance kitchen. This is the ambulance shop in Alexandria, Virginia. You see partially completed Rosecrans ambulances there, and all these guys proudly posing, these wheelwrights and carriage makers posing with their tools out in front of this shop. Pretty interesting photograph. I've mentioned the medicine wagon. These are like first cousins to ambulances, okay? Letterman also develops this. We don't know as much about this because this paperwork doesn't seem to survive. We don't really know what his looked like. There were several different models made during the war, and they were designed to roll. Every brigade in the Army of the Potomac was to have one of these, and they contained extra medical supplies, okay? And there's a great quote by Edward Whiteman of the 9th New York from a camp near Sharpsburg, Maryland after the Battle of Antietam on October 4th. He writes, you want to know what sick call is like? Well, after breakfast, the doctor's call is beat, and the sick go to the medical wagon, which is fitted up as a small apothecary shop for advice and medicine. Some go to shirk work, which is the age-old story, right? But these are really interesting developments as well. And in our museum, we have recreated the back of one of these. This is an Ottenreith pattern, different pattern, but you can see all the drawers in there and the medicine vials, that these could roll right on a battlefield to help provide doctors and surgeons with medicine right where they need it. And this is really fascinating. This is an Alfred Woad sketch. This was done after the Battle of Antietam, or right after, and it'll appear as an engraving in Harper's Weekly, entitled Citizen Volunteers Assisting the Wounded in the Field of Battle, okay? And what you see here are still some wagons being used. Again, they don't have all the ambulances yet, and you see some civilians helping to load wounded men into one of these wagons. It's a little hard to see, but you see some surgeons working on a patient right here, and this is a medicine wagon. If you look closely, can you see the drawers in there? Yeah, so there's drawers in here, and at the back tailgate, right here, is a hospital steward or a surgeon or somebody either mixing up medicine or getting bandages out right here in the tailgate of the wagon as it was designed to be used. So we know these medicine wagons were in the field as early as the Battle of Antietam. And you know, it's kind of a little thing tucked away, but that's pretty cool that they had that there and it's depicted. So, in addition to the ambulances themselves, Letterman wants to improve the esprit de corps of the men who work on them. Previous to this, as I said, these ambulance drivers and stretcher bearers, they would generally get the weakest soldiers, right? And Letterman says, no, I want you to either detail me or assign me good men for the ambulance corps. I want, you know, sturdy men to do this. And this is all in General Orders number 147. He will give ambulance drivers and stretcher bearers a specific uniform. And you can see it partially illustrated here. I know it's a little dark, but you'll notice the chevrons on his coat that indicate his rank. The point goes up instead of, in most cases in the Union Army, the point's down. And the chevrons are green, which is the color of the medical department. Also, it is really hard to see, but on his forage cap, you know, those unique little caps they wore, they had a green band 2 inches wide around the base of the cap as well, okay? And so he prescribes it for these guys. And what he's doing there is two things. One, he's giving them identifying features, even if they don't have chevrons, that if you're just a rank and file, you can identify a member of the ambulance corps. You know they're there to help you, which is hopefully good for morale. He's also telling the guys in the ambulance corps, you got a specific job to do and don't shirk your duty, because people know what your job is. And he's trying to help build up their esprit de corps. That green band on the hat is the Red Cross before the Red Cross existed. As far as I can tell, this is the first time healthcare workers are specifically identified by uniform adornments in American history. Okay? So it's pretty significant, even if it may not seem like that. And 2 years later, this stuff spreads out. George Thomas, another Union general you may have heard of, he commanded an army in the Western Theater, the Army of the Cumberland. He will adopt green bands for his ambulance men to wear as well, okay? So it starts to spread out. The other thing that's interesting, we get a little bit of a social change going on here, because more and more African Americans are used as ambulance drivers. Not just for USCT regiments, but in general. This is a close-up of a photograph taken at City Point, Virginia, the big supply base for Grant's Army during the Petersburg campaign. This is a zoom in, and you can see all these guys are African American ambulance drivers. And this was even suggested in the newspapers. The Daily Evansville Journal had an article making the argument that, you know, they are efficient as laborers because a lot of them would come in the lines and work, and as domestics in camp, and they should also be employed on entrenchments, fortifications, or in the ambulance corps. And they start using them more and more. Lieutenant John Blue of the 11th Virginia Cavalry was wounded at the Wilderness and captured, and he's hauled off to a hospital, and he wrote in his memoirs, the Teamsters were nearly all Negroes. He's referring to the ambulance drivers, okay? So we're finding, you know, African American men are being purposed to use as well as the white men as well, the ambulance drivers, I should say, excuse me. So, implementation. Let's go back to the Battle of Antietam. This is the first time that Letterman really tries to use ambulances in the field. And again, after Manassas, wounded lay on the battlefield for a week. But they had everybody off the battlefield, all Union wounded, and as many Confederate as were left were off the battlefield, according to Letterman, in 24 hours after the fighting stopped. They were in field hospitals. You know, I don't want to make it too pretty a picture, you know, I mean, these field hospitals are, you know, overwhelmed, but they had these guys picked up and off the battlefield, at least, okay? And by Fredericksburg, all the Army of the Potomac is now outfitted with ambulances, and they have about 1,000 at their use at the time. And at that engagement, where the wounded were clustered a little more tightly, they had all the wounded off the battlefield the evening of the main assaults. They didn't even wait 24 hours, okay? So it's getting much more efficient. I think the apex if you will, of the ambulance corps is the Battle of Gettysburg. And one thing it's interesting to point out, Antietam and Fredericksburg and Gettysburg are all, because of the built environment, they're easier to get wounded off the battlefield. Because all three of those places have cleared fields, good roads, big buildings nearby to house wounded, right? Big, especially at Antietam and Gettysburg, big barns. You can quickly make hospitals. And when it gets into 1864 to the wilderness, it's a different story. Because, you know, the narrow roads, you don't have big barns, you have much fewer cleared fields you can easily get in and out of. But those engagements are sort of lend themselves to helping get wounded men off the field.
Was there ever a concerted effort to identify these people wounded? Was that never?
Not really, no. That's the big, one of the big lapses, you know, no dog tags. And actually, it's interesting that you say that when this is up here, because they also put bureaucracy in place and paperwork, and this is an example of it. They had ambulance books that they were supposed to fill out with the name of the patient and where they were delivered. But you can imagine a lot of times that doesn't happen. We have this one in our collection, and you can see this is the ambulance corps headquarters for the 9th Corps, and you can see all this paperwork in here, okay? So they're trying to make it better, and in some cases they do use these, but you know, when you have 17,000 casualties that occur in 12 hours, you know, you're doing good just to get them out of there, right? So it's better, but it's not perfect. I'll give you an example here. During the Gettysburg campaign, Captain Thomas Livermore, originally served with the 18th New Hampshire, was the head of the 2nd Corps ambulance train in the Army of the Potomac. And the Army of the Potomac and these big armies are divided in big groups called corps, okay? There's a big chunk of the Army of the Potomac. And he has, under his command, 13 officers, 350 to 400 men, 300 horses, and more than 100 ambulances, just in that one corps.
Pardon me, is that the same Livermore that wrote a book about the losses after the war?
Yes, Numbers and Losses.
Thank you.
Yep, that's the same one. Captain Thomas Livermore. And he, you know, you get a sense of, you know, more than 100 ambulances under his command. It's pretty well organized. At Gettysburg, just to give you another example, in his official record report, Letterman writes, 1 officer and 4 privates were killed and 17 wounded while in the discharge of their duties. So there's hazards to this work. These guys are working close to the front line. One ambulance driver left an account. He said that my horses were in harness for 72 hours. We were non-stop, night and day, trying to get the wounded out of there. Okay? That's you know, how hard they're working to do this. And Letterman says of Gettysburg, of the 14,000 wounded that he was aware of, everyone was off the battlefield by the morning of July 4th. You know, through this nonstop effort. And of course the Confederates are retreating, and that's a very different story. And we're going to talk a little bit about the Confederates, but they're trying to take their wounded with them, and he's talking about the wounded that he can get to, but still, he estimates they got 14,000 wounded off by the morning of July 4th. I want to show you this picture too. This is a famous photograph taken in 1864 of the 57th New York's camp. And like I said, you see, that's a tripler ambulance back here. You can tell the distinctive way that this sort of brings in here. That's a tripler, and these are Coolidges, those 2-wheelers. So they're still using them. This is a stretcher, also designed by Coolidge, the same guy. It's like a chaise lounge. And we have one in our collection. It's not practical to move around very easily, but it's like a hospital bed that you can take out into the field. So there's one deployed there, which is pretty interesting as well. And then, this is still the Eastern Theater. This is a famous photograph of Grant and his staff outside Massaponax Church. After the battles of the Wilderness, they're moving south on the road from Spotsylvania Courthouse. This is Grant right here. And what we see going down the road are 5th Corps ambulances. They've got the 5th Corps Maltese Cross on them. Those are Rosecrans ambulances heading down the road. That's the ambulance train passing by, ambulances in the field. That's pretty cool. Western Theater, I don't want to neglect it. I want to point out that most of what I talk about is in the Army of the Potomac, because that really is sort of the epicenter for a lot of these changes that are going to spread out. So, Army of the Cumberland Surgeon Glover Perrin, that you see here, he's the medical director. He will adopt the Letterman plan for his Army. And he also will adopt the ambulance service, because when he takes over in February of '63, he realizes the ambulance corps is weak and not structured very well, and he basically just takes what Letterman is doing. Even that, though, after Chickamauga, about 2,500 Chickamauga wounded are left behind when the Union Army retreats back to Chattanooga, because they can't get to them. And then finally, on March 30th, 1863, Grant will approve General Orders number 22, and that will establish an ambulance corps in the Army of the Tennessee, another large Western Theater Union Army. So these ideas are spreading. And it's interesting that it's not standardized, right? It starts with one army and spreads to the others. This is a photograph on the top right of Camp Nelson, Kentucky. Camp Nelson was a huge supply base, refugee camp for African Americans, and USC training area. And what you're looking at is a big yard of Rosecrans ambulances, stockpiled for campaigning in the Western Theater. They're all sitting there waiting to go. And on the top left, we see an ad in a Cincinnati paper that basically says, the first paragraph, they're taking proposals for the building of ambulances, 100 ambulances. The sample wheeling pattern may be seen at the government wagon yard on Elm Street. And so they're advertising for contractors to come in and build ambulances to the Rosecrans or wheeling pattern. That's, and then, I honestly don't know why I have the ad for, oh, I guess there's another ad for the Wheeling Daily Intelligencer for, oh, that's where that ad's from, excuse me. They brought it back. And then you can see Camp Nelson photographed there as well. Talk about the Confederate side. The gentleman on the left is Surgeon General Samuel Preston Moore, who did a remarkable job developing a medical department out of nothing. During the conflict, he will develop Chimborazo Hospital in Richmond, perhaps the biggest hospital of the war. The Army of Northern Virginia medical director, there on the right, Lafayette Guild. He is Letterman's counterpart, and Guild basically complains about ambulance shortages the whole war. Each Confederate regiment was supposed to have more than around 10 ambulances, but they never reached that goal. And Confederate General Surgeon John Chisholm said that regiments rarely had more than one ambulance at their disposal. In 1863, in the entire state of Mississippi, there were only 38 ambulances. And in 1865, at the beginning of that year, there was not one ambulance in the Department of West Virginia or East Tennessee. They just didn't have any. There was a Richmond ambulance shop in Richmond that produced 264 ambulances in 1864. That was their peak production. But compare, you know, there's 100 ambulances alone in the 2nd Corps of the Army of the Potomac. And by 1864, those 5th Corps ambulances we saw going by, the 5th Corps had 171 ambulances, right? So they've got 171, just a portion of the Union Army, and the Richmond ambulance shop is only making less than 300 a year. Guild, after Gettysburg, writes orders basically saying gather any wagons you can find, because they didn't have enough ambulances, and we can't take most of the guys, so bring them in the central areas so that when the federal surgeons take over, they can easily find them. You know, and mention Guild, if you've been to Gettysburg, he's got to get his wounded all the way across South Mountain, back into Virginia, into Winchester, where they've got a whole bunch more wounded from the Second Battle of Winchester. And then most of these guys, they got to get to Richmond, where the main hospitals are. The Confederates also follow suit and identify ambulance corps members. There's a sketch on the left. Sometimes it's just simple white paper badges that they wore in their hats that said ambulance corps. They also had these armbands or hat bands that we have. This is one in our collection, ambulance corps, that you could wear around your arm or your hat to identify what you're doing. And Lieutenant Colonel James Fremantle, English observer, said that in Gettysburg, in the rear of each regiment were a certain number of unarmed men carrying stretchers and wearing in their hats the red badges of the ambulance corps. There was a volunteer Richmond Committee for Wounded. They were civilians that followed the Army to help take off men off the battlefields as well, and they wore armbands of red as well. Surgeon John Chisholm, Confederate surgeon, writes in 1862, "The members of our ambulance corps are designated by wearing around their caps a red band with ambulance corps printed in conspicuous white letters." So they are also following suit and marking caregivers on the battlefield when they can. Kind of wrapping up here. How long have I talked? Oh, long enough to stultify people, I suppose. What happens to these guys? You know, these medical, somewhat revolutionary guys. Well, they all get forced out. They're all forced out. It's kind of interesting. McClellan, Little Mac, as you know, fell out of favor as a commander of the Army of the Potomac. He eventually was relieved of command, and he will be gone in November of 1862. And to his credit, you know, he, I think, of all the Army of the Potomac commanders, was the most medically aware. For example, at Chancellorsville, Joe Hooker will not allow, has a quarrel with Letterman, and he will not allow Letterman to bring as many ambulances into the field as Letterman wants, because he sees them as an impediment. He doesn't think like McClellan. So McClellan goes, and that begins to weaken things. And then Hammond will be dismissed in August of 1864. What happens to Hammond? A couple things. One, he tries to make the Union surgeons stop using mercury as medicine. Mercury is poison. Do not take it. But it was, at the time, it was like the aspirin in the toolkit for a lot of these guys, you know? If you're constipated, take mercury. If you had diarrhea, take mercury. They gave it for everything. One of the ways they decided if you had enough in your system and the dosage was right, if it was making you really sick. Okay, it's making Shoaf sick, he must have enough mercury, he'll get better soon, right? To save Shoaf, we have to destroy him. So, you know, that's that sort of paradox, right? And Hammond is like, get it out of there, it's poison, I don't want you to have it. And the old guard of surgeons, especially those that had been passed over when he became Surgeon General, rise up and protest. And they go to Stanton and complain. And Hammond and Stanton did not get along. Hammond was always badgering Stanton. They're both sort of similar. They can be irascible, and they're in conflict a lot. So Stanton sends Hammond on this tour of hospitals in the South to get him out of D.C. Sends him on this tour, and while he's gone, he meets with some of these other surgeons and some people. What do we do? When he comes back, when Hammond comes back, they bring him up on a trumped up court-martial charge. And Hammond resigns. He said, I'm not dealing with this. He resigns. I think it's Grover Cleveland. President Grover Cleveland will finally restore Hammond's rank to him in the post-war years, because they take his rank from him as well. He will go on a very successful post-war medical career. That doesn't hurt him. But he's gone. And he's replaced by Jonathan Barnes. He's very competent. We just acquired Jonathan Barnes' dress code. He is the last Surgeon General of the United States Army. He serves till 1883. And he was made a Major General. He was at the end of the war, right before the war ends, actually. He visited Lincoln as he lay dying in the Peterson House. He also oversaw the Lincoln autopsy. And I think it's a good chance he was wearing the coat that we now have when he was doing that, which is pretty interesting to think about. It's his coat. But Barnes will replace him, and Barnes has the good sense not to wreck everything. He keeps that three-stage system in place. He keeps the ambulance corps in place. You know, he's like, these work, we're not getting rid of them. So, you know, he at least has that good sense. But Hammond is gone, and when Hammond's gone, Letterman loses his top cover, right? Now Letterman's kind of exposed. He's rankled some feathers as well along the way. He's seen as sort of a young upstart, and he will be relieved of his duties as medical director and sent to become the inspector of hospitals in the Department of Susquehanna, which is up in Harrisburg, York area, which is a backwater. And Letterman says, I'm done with this too, and he resigns in December of 1864. He will resign. It's like Letterman gets more credit now than he did during the war. The United States Army still uses a 3-stage system. They call it the Letterman system. They teach in their classes that Jonathan Letterman is the father of their wounded removal system. Now, it comes from Europe a little bit. That's okay. You know, he gets the credit, and that's fine. But they still use it, you know? And that's still used in civilian life as well, really. You know, in mass casualty events, the 3 stages are still used because it's efficient. And as a coda, finally on March 16th, 1864, a law is passed that requires an ambulance corps is official U.S. Army policy. That means every army during the war had to have an ambulance corps based on the Letterman pattern. So eventually it does become official policy in March of 1864 for all the armies. And then, what I think very interesting is that immediately after the war, and I mean immediately, civilian hospital ambulance services are established. The first one is in Cincinnati in 1865. Cincinnati was a big Union hospital center there on the Ohio River. And as soon as the war ends, the Cincinnati Commercial Hospital establishes an ambulance service. The next one is New York City's Bellevue Hospital. They had 2 ambulances the first year that they put it in place. By the next year, they added 5 more. And from there, these ambulance services just take off until, of course, today, they're commonplace. So in conclusion, I know this sounds corny. Oh, I want to show you this last. Oh, there's Bellevue. Sorry. There's a post-war hospital, ambulance, going out on a call. And this is one of my, these are Rosecrans ambulances near O'Hare Hospital in DC. And I like this because they're just, the guys are muddy, the ambulances are muddy. These things have been out in the field doing their duty here. And who knows, they could have just brought guys in. But what I always like to say is, one of the easiest ways to draw a straight line from the Civil War to today is ambulances. Before the war, they don't exist here. After the war, immediately they become a part of civilian life. So though it's corny, I like to say, when you hear the siren of an ambulance, that's the Civil War talking to you. Thank you. I'll take any questions.
Question I have, in that Delafield visit to Crimea, they also looked at use of railroads
Yes.
in that time. Did any of that translate to ambulance?
Yes, it did. I'm
Railroad
not as well versed in that aspect of it as the ambulances, but yes, they converted, as far as wounded removal, they had specialized rail cars built to transport wounded men that actually had like big rubber bands that you would hang the stretchers from to try to take out the shock. And you know, they would use box cars or whatever as well, just to get guys in on straw, but they did make specialized cars for the wounded. And that was a European example as well. The Europeans also used those medical knapsacks. We used those during the war. A lot of that stuff comes right over when they see how efficient it is. And of course, militarily, McClellan he sees all those big earthworks they build for the sieges. And of course, you know, he's an earthwork guy at Yorktown particularly, you know. So there's a big, the Delafield Commission has a lot of influence on this Civil War here.
Now, when did they start using ambulances for care as well? 'Cause it looks like by these pictures, it would just get them in and get rolling and get them to the.
That's right. And those first civilian ambulances, that might be a doctor's bag there, but the ambulances are primarily used to pick someone up and get them back, okay? I gotta double check this, but one of the first ambulance service to use paramedics and administer treatment on the ambulance was in Pittsburgh, in an African American community, because there, the ambulances were sometimes hospital-based or private companies, and they were having trouble having the white ambulance guys go into the African American neighborhoods they thought was too dangerous. And so they started their own ambulance service in the Hill District. And they actually trained paramedics to ride on these ambulances because they had a longer drive to the white hospitals. So they're like, we better try to provide some care. And that is the late 50s, early 60s. And that's documentable. I think it's Freedom House? Freedom House Ambulance Service?
Yes.
Somebody agreeing with me?
Yes. Yes. We're from
Okay,
Pittsburgh.
okay, so I'm right on it, right?
Yeah.
Good. Yeah, so that's one of the first, 1950s and 60s. And that's what, oh, I'm getting a spam call here. That's kind of what started that. Yeah, they were mostly for getting people back, and then if someone was, again, it's not like there's a phone that they can call in 1878, you know what I mean? There's like someone has to get to the hospital, we got a sick person, and they just jump in there and get them back, that kind of thing. Yeah.
I believe it's not till the 1940s, really, that you have ambulance services in this immediate area.
I wouldn't doubt
But I
it.
think the funeral homes, Umpson, Winchester,
Yes.
Donners, and Woodstock,
Yeah,
they were the ones that provide the ambulance
Yeah.
services, which is.
yeah, I know, and it just keeps evolving. But I was just shocked when I'm like, what do you mean they didn't use ambulances, And so it's just kind of interesting how these things develop. Yes, sir.
Did the ambulance travel with a small group of soldiers, or did they go to the different?
They would be usually organized by a brigade. Now, the ambulances, if they want 3 ambulances with a regiment, it actually could depend. Sometimes they would be behind the regiment in question on the march, or sometimes they would put them back at the end of a brigade, which is several regiments marching. It varied a little bit, but they tried to keep them as close to the units that they were assigned to as possible, to keep it all organized.
So was there like a special signal then that they would know that their services were needed to flag to them?
When they approached the battlefield, the brigade, the commanding senior surgeon in the brigade would call the surgeons together, and they would try to begin to pick out field hospital locations that they would stage the ambulances at, sort of relatively close to the front lines. There's always a degree of chaos in this until they get it really situated. Letterman complains a lot because he didn't I think Hooker only allowed like 3 ambulances per brigade into the field at Chancellorsville instead of 3 per regiment, something like that. And Letterman, that's not enough, and wounded removal at Chancellorsville is not good. The Confederates hold the field there too, so the Union have to leave a lot behind, but that's one of the reasons. But they could get put back in the rear as well. And I think one of the things that leads to Letterman's downfall is that after Gettysburg, he writes a really snarky report. Letterman's reports are long. If you look in the official records after Antietam and Gettysburg, he writes a lot. And he basically snarking at Meade, the commander of the army at the time, and he's like, once again, a lot of my stuff was too far to the rear. I told you, I thought I had this all figured out in the fall of 1862. Apparently not. That kind of attitude comes through. And so I've got to dig deeper into this. He and Meade, there's friction pretty quickly, because Meade has just taken over the army. at Gettysburg. You know, this is their meeting, you know? And so, Meade wasn't too fond of him, you know? And that was part of the issue of him getting kind of pushed aside. Yes, sir.
Go ahead, please for her.
The Warren Heritage Society has in their collection a pre-Civil War quilt, completely drenched in blood.
Wow.
And we're trying to connect the dots. We know that a Colonel Sheets, who was up and coming.
He's a Virginia
Yes.
colonel, isn't he?
Yes, he was killed at the Battle of Front Royal in Buckton, right up the road.
Okay.
We know from diaries, he was brought to the Boone House on Chester Street from the battlefield with a soldier, and we got that soldier's name. And
Oh, wow.
well, we're trying to connect these things. This has been in a box folded up for 31 years,
Wow.
and no one bothered to unfold it, and they didn't see the blood.
When did you unfold it?
About 4 months ago. Now, have you ever seen, we think this says Baker. Baker was the second lieutenant. He would have been right there when Sheets was killed. Did any of the ambulances grab people? Is it so much of a stretch to think they grabbed a quilt?
No, it's not a stretch, especially that early in the war.
I didn't know
Is
if it
this
was
61,
strong.
62?
Pardon?
Is this 1861, 62 era,
Yeah,
the fight that takes place?
yeah, 60.
Yeah, that would not be a stretch at all. That would be, you know, remember the Union, they don't really get their ambulance corps started till August of 62, and that's before this. So it's gonna be even more disorganized on the Confederate side.
And they might have grabbed a quilt.
Absolutely, from a nearby home. This could have been on this Baker it could have been his quilt he took into the field with him, like his blanket.
Well, that's what, I've never seen staples like that.
That's,
Would a soldier have done
I
that?
think someone has done
This
that
is mine.
later.
Those staples don't look, they look,
They look old, you
Old.
think?
yeah.
But I would think they'd be discolored. Why isn't that discolored with the blood too?
Yeah,
Because that's cloth, right?
yeah, that's. put
So
on
I think
later,
it's
that's
been
put on
applied,
later.
put on after.
Okay.
And
okay.
it could have been just an indication of who donated it. They came from the
Yeah,
family.
this is actually the lining, the back is blood.
Okay.
Yeah, so, we're just trying to figure out.
I'll give you my card. And then if you have any more questions, you can contact
We
me.
figured this is like, it's pretty.
That's a
simple.
pretty fascinating artifact.
We don't know where to go next. You
Uh,
can't take DNA, we've been told, and
Well,
it's still contaminated.
Oh, really? Can they make sure it's actually blood? Can you at least do that?
They can do that.
I would have it tested to make sure it's human blood.
Who will do that?
Contact the Smithsonian Institution. They do that stuff. Or the National Museum of Health and Medicine. Well, don't you have a forensics department here in the police department?
Yeah, we've already been there.
They wanna do it?
They won't do it.
Can't Liz lean on them?
But I'm only 4'11".
Well, Liz is,
He said we went to their forensic department.
yeah.
And, he said they are so busy with real cases now, they don't have time to do this.
Just take that in screaming, there's been a murder in my house! And can you help me? And maybe they won't know. You know, and then see, but contact me and I'll ask around in my museum too, and see if I can get you some more help with
Yeah, they
that.
said the DNA would not only be too contaminated by the age.
Yeah,
But by people handling it over the years.
I'm sure.
But he came in,
Yeah,
he was shot through the heart,
Uh-huh.
instantly died, and his next buddy brought him into the Boone House next door to the Warren Heritage Society. And it was, we think, kept there for over 100 years.
Wow.
So we really want to know.
Yeah, well,
Who
reach
died?
out to me and remind me that we talked here, and I'll ask around at my work.
Thank you so much.
Because I know we've used people to do stuff like that,
Okay.
and I'll see what I can find out.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Obviously, the purpose of all this is to save lives. And there been a study as a pre-war, post-war kind of how many lives were saved because of this system?
That's a
compared
good
to
question, and
before
I'm not aware of
or
that.
Something like that.
I'm not aware of that. There may very well have been, you know, the Army doing all this kind of stuff, but if there is, I'm not aware. It did save a lot of lives, you know, I can't quantify it, but it surely did, yeah. Yes, ma'am?
Did the surgeons train their stretcher bearers with like minimal first aid, or were they basically
They were
just
basically,
get them on the ambulance?
they were, their primary responsibility was to work on the ambulance. The hospital stewards, which were like the NCOs of the medical department, the sergeants of the medical department that assisted the surgeons, they would draft men from the regiments to serve as nurses, okay? And those are the guys, in the field at least, that did a lot of that actual first aid stuff, okay? You know, the duty of the ambulance guys is to pick them up and get them where they need to get their treatment. So they would have male nurses that were drafted from the ranks and taught some basic stuff. Some of those guys, if they're good enough, they would just stay with the medical department. Some of them rotated out. And then, of course, at the field hospitals, you would find a lot of volunteer female nurses as well, which is a new thing for the United States. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Now, you said how dangerous it was for for the ambulance groups.